Please join me in welcoming Mike Dorion.
I feel like I'm in Star Trek here, and maybe I should cut a hole in the screen and stand behind it. Would that, we'll just get a going theme here? Okay. What time do you want me to go till?
I'll tell you in a second.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm just going to get right into it. So we're going to chat about the life in the soil. So all the little critters that are down in there that we may or may not be able to see, okay? So before we get started, though, I just want you to think about these two questions when we're thinking about working with our soils or managing our soils. Now, the first one is, what can a forest teach us? Okay? Now, does anybody fertilize a forest? Does anybody water a forest? Okay, so what are some of the things that are going on there that we can mimic in our back 40 or our backyard? Okay? And then the other one is, what are the four essentials that us as human beings need to survive as a species? Can you guys tell me what those four are? Shelter, water, food, and air, the oxygen, right? Okay? So those are the four that we need, but also that's the four that a lot of our critters need as well. So if we can make that relation, then when we're working and managing our soils, then if we can give them those things, then we're going to have a lot better success at getting the results that we want. Okay? Oh. Let's shut that down. Or not.
Technology's just all moving.
Yeah. So when we're looking at these things, we just want to make sure that if we can maximize that kind of stuff in the soil, so the water, the shelter, the food, the oxygen, then they're going to be a lot more savvy and doing the things that we need them to do. And the main reason is going into that next slide is if we look at what we're doing is we're supposed to be growing food, yes? Whether it's for humans or it's for animals. But if we look at the results of the nutrient side of things, the nutrients have been declining and declining and declining. So we're not actually really growing food. So this is where I think we should start looking at the fact that instead of just looking at yield, I think a farmer should be rewarded on growing really nutrient-dense food. So the more nutrient-dense it is, then the more premium of the dollar that they get, right? So just trying to start to think of that kind of stuff. Now, if we look up at the sky, we can see the stars, and we can see them and go, oh, wow, this is amazing on a really dark, dark night. But because the stuff that's underneath our feet, we can't see them, so it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't think about them. So if you start looking at like the stuff that NASA's been doing and the amount of money that they spend out there, they're spending it all on this stuff trying to figure out more that they know about Mars than we do about the stuff that's responsible for us to live as a species on this planet. Okay, so let's start. The research is really starting to come along, but it needs to go up another level. So if we can start figuring out how that stuff works and how we can work better with it, then again, we're going to have better results. Okay, so for the longest time we've been looking at soil, we've been looking just at the physical and the chemical components. But we need to start to look at the biological components as well. So we can't have one without the other. All three work together. So if we realize that and start using that, again, we're going to have those better results. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, we need to start to look at the biological. They all work together. So let's dive a little bit more into that. So before I start spouting on like grade 8 to grade 10 biology, we have to realize too that these critters are everywhere, right? So for every human cell that we have, there's about 10 bacteria that work with that human cell. So you and me are not you and me, we're like we and us, right? There's lots going on there. And there's a couple of these neat little TED Talks that are online that these guys are talking about this. So that we're like this like ecology ourselves. There's lots going on there. So if we can look at that for ourselves as well, then we can start working with that in the soil as well. And the neat thing is that I was always told to respect my elders, well, these guys are ancient. So they need to deserve that respect because they figured out this stuff way before we showed up. So you probably have heard of it as the soil food web. I also like to call it, I forget who had mentioned it, but they called it their micro herd. So if you've learned how to take care of your cattle or pigs or chickens or something like that, well, if we can start to learn how to use these guys, then again, we're going to have those better results, right? And it all starts, so has anybody seen the movie The Lion King, whether it's with your kids or the grandkids? Okay, so, you know, you can admit it if you've seen it. I've seen it a few times, okay? So there's that one scene where the baboon holds up the baby lion, and then you hear Elton John kick in, and it's like, the circle of life, okay? So this is where that circle of life starts, okay? It's these guys first. And then we move into those larger species, right? So we start with the bacteria and the fungi working with the plant roots, and then we bring in the predators. So we're going to dive into how these guys all work and different ways that we can look to see how they're operating in our soil, okay? All right. So another way to look at it is we're all familiar with the gut ecology that we have in our digestive systems. Okay, so if you've seen a yogurt commercial, they talk about, oh, this has 1 billion probiotics, and this one has 1 trillion. So that's their sales pitch now. So that microbiology is responsible for when we eat our food, we chew it up, we swallow it, and then the gut system breaks that stuff down into its basic components, its nutrients, and then the blood is able to absorb it and get it through to the system, right? So that's what those microorganisms are also doing down in the soil. They're breaking that stuff down, gathering those nutrients, and then being able to make them available for our plants to use. Okay, so they're like the probiotics of the soil. Make sense? We got head nods, that's good. Okay, so a lot of this is happening down in what's called the rhizosphere. So a plant will take energy from the sun and put down some of that. They'll put it out to make plant or branches and leaves and fruits and seeds, but a lot of it goes down into its roots. And they put it down there to attract something that they want to work with. They're not going to do that to attract something that's going to be detrimental to it or harm it. So they're doing that in a way. So I like to look at this as, it's like a party. Everybody likes to party, right? Party? No? Yeah, party? Okay. So we want to have a party. So let's look at what like a soil party looks like. So when the plant is doing that, it's like it's sending out invitations. So maybe this is a little old school. Nobody really probably sends out paper invitations anymore. It's probably a little Evite or whatever. But that's their basis. They're attracting these guys into them because they want to work with them. Okay? So the soil party is going on. So who's the first to show up? The first is we get the bacteria. So the bacteria is the basis of our first microorganisms. They're the real small guys, and they just sit in the soil and they kind of just vibrate. They like to eat really simple sugars, but they take in a lot of the nutrients and they hold it within themselves. So they almost become like little bags of fertilizer. And that's their basis. And there's billions and billions of them. And a huge diversity of them as well. And a lot of them all have different functions that they work with. So they're considered a decomposer. So this is something, let's see if this will work. Oh, I don't know if I can, there we go. So this is just a 400-time magnification on a microscope, and I'm just going in and out of focus. And all the little tiny things that you can see, those are little bits of bacteria, okay? So as you get more familiar with what you're looking at under the slide, you'll start to see different shapes. So some are round, some are rod-shaped, and then they start forming little chains, and some will be fat, some will be skinny, and you get into a bit of diversity of what these guys are looking like. So bacteria are pretty resilient. They're usually not affected too much in our soils, but it's good to know that they're there. Now, a real simple way to see if we've got some biology happening in our soil, specifically the bacteria, is if we pull out a plant and we have a lot of that microaggregation around the root zone, like it's hanging on to that root, okay? So it's called the Rastafarian rootsman, okay, if we want to have a little fun with it. So that's just a great indicator to show you that. If you pull those roots out and they're bare, well then that's showing you that that's not making any kind of aggregates there, which then we're going to start getting compaction, and we're not going to get as good as root depth, okay? So what's happening there is the bacteria, as they're mining the sand-silt clay and the organic matter to getting these nutrients, they're using enzymes that are like glue-like. So then they start forming these aggregates, which then increases the air and water infiltration, okay? Now the next one is, if we're gonna have a party, we've gotta have fun guys there. Okay, the fun guys, so usually recognized as mushrooms. So under the soil, these guys are decomposers as well, but they're more focusing on the more heavier carbon foods, okay? So they like those more stubbial stuff. So like our stubble, straw, that kind of stuff, even wood mulch and whatnot too. And then we look at the mycorrhizal side of things. These fungi are forming that intimate relationship with the root zones and actually helping bring nutrients to it for a trade. They want some of those sugars and those root exudates as well, okay? So we'll dive a little bit more into them. So here's a little, okay, so this is just a strand here. So when you're looking under the microscope, sometimes you'll see strands like this, and it could be just a root. But really to decipher what it is you'll get little kind of ridges like that. Those are called septae, and that's just how the fungus grows in sections. And then this one here, as I was zooming in and out, focusing in and out, I actually had 3 different types of fungal there. So they're slightly different color, they're slightly larger diameter, and then as I'm focusing in and out, they're in the different levels of that sphere of the microscope slide, okay? So that's the thing that we really want to start seeing is we don't want to just have highly bacterial soils, we want to have some fungal in there too. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Oh, thanks. So another reason why the fungal are around is they're actually helping with disease suppression. So this is an electromagnetic picture where it's called a nemophage. So it's a type of fungal that forms these circles and it puts out pheromones that are similar to weak or sick roots. So then a root-feeding nematode, this little microscopic worm starts to come and wants to nibble on it, but he gets stuck into those little holes, and then the fungus swells up, and he's now trapped it, and then he puts out an acid and sucks the life out of the thing. So these guys have figured out ways to start to treat some of our problems in a microbiology way, okay? So just knowing some of these things and making our soil as healthy as possible, then we're gonna have more of these things in the soil to fight the problems when they do come around, okay? And then another thing, when we look at the mycorrhizal side of things, this is a big thing that Dr. Catherine Jones in Australia talks about, is it's a way to take some of that carbon and take it down deeper in the profile. So if we look at like a fungal strand, that's all carbon, okay? When we go into a healthy forest and we pick up a good handful of that soil, 75% of that is fungal hyphae. So that one picture that we had of the microscope, I could pick that up and there'll be 10 meters of fungal hyphae in that handful of soil. That's crazy, okay? So that scope of that smallness is actually really huge. So we just have to be respectful of that. So are we familiar with mycorrhizal? I know it's starting to become a little bit more popular, but do we understand much about it? A little bit here, okay? All right, well, let's dive a little deeper into it. Okay, so there's 2 different kinds, basically, that we've got an endomycorrhizal and an ectomycorrhizal, and they just have different relationships of how they form with the root. So the one that we're gonna focus on is the ectomycorrhizal, or avascular mycorrhizal fungi. So what it does is it actually interlocks with the root, and it looks like it's almost like a parasite at first, but then they form a mutual relationship. So that root will now, or that mycorrhizal will now extend further to find phosphorus and water and other nutrients like calcium and bring it up to the plant root and then go, hey, I got some calcium here. What do you got for me? And the plant will be like, I got some sugar. You want to do a trade? And they do a lunchtime tradesies and everybody wins. Okay, so it forms this relationship so that they can work together and they benefit each other. So this just gives you a better idea of, okay, we got nothing going on this side, so that root's going to have a harder time getting those nutrients in that water, and then we get that mycorrhizal relationship really going. Well, now there's that much more chance for that root, that plant, to get the nutrients in the water that it needs, okay? So this is a picture that they show with the ectomycorrhizal. So this here is the actual plant root, the orange part. So it's got maybe 5% of the soil that it's making contact with, and then all that other white matter is that ectomycorrhizal reaching that much further, mining at the sand-silt clay, the organic matter, pulling the nutrients and water back to the plant. Okay? So super important to see how that works. And some of the research is showing now with some of the ectomycorrhizals is they'll actually connect different trees together. So one will help the other. So a birch tree next to a larch tree, the birch starts getting sick, the larch will actually help the birch, and vice versa. Mind-blowing. Okay? So these guys know what they're doing. They've been doing it for a long time. So if we can understand and respect that and learn how to work with it instead of against it, we're going to have a lot easier results. Okay, so another really important thing with fungi is the calcium side. So this is a study that Elaine Ingham did with the Soil Food Web. Now, calcium, what's it important for? Well, how about for ourselves first? Bones, right? Okay, so then it's also important for the plant's bones or its structure. But plants don't have bones. Okay, but if we look at a plant cell wall, it's kind of like their bone. So if a plant grows really quick with lots of nitrogen and they don't have the equivalent calcium coming up, then they've got kind of weak bones. So now they're more susceptible to disease and pathogens getting in there. But if we have good enough calcium, then they've got those strong bones, so they can be more rigid to that, right? So what they did here was they took a parent material, sterilized, put some calcium on top, ran it through, and see how much leached through that material. So 100% just in the plant material. They added 5% organic matter, 98% through. They added just bacteria, 95. They added the fungi, boom. The fungi held it in the soil. So when we start having really compacted soils, they're beat up really hard, or we're disturbing it and flipping it a lot, then we're going to disrupt this fungal activity, and then now we're losing that ability to hold an important nutrient like calcium in the soil. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so just like a quick thing, these are just some of the things that we're using them for our bones and teeth. If we have it low in our soils, then we're going to start getting some different weeds in there too. So that's when we start looking at what weeds are growing. They're going to be telling us, they're indicating us what's happening in our soil and if certain things are missing. And then there's indicators of what's going on with our animals and stuff as well. We start seeing like milk fever and warts, and that's a calcium deficiency, okay? Now, let's move back into the party. All right, protozoa. So going back to grade 10 science, biology. So these is our ciliates, our amoeba, our flagellates. So ciliates are these little microorganisms that have hairs all around the body, so very similar to the hairs that we have down on the inside of our throat. So when we clear our throat, it's bringing stuff up from our chest so that we can swallow it down again. So that's how they used to move themselves around. And then flagellates have these long flagellums. They're like a long hair or a tail that whips them around to move them. They're kind of bumbly, but then they use it to grab bacteria and eat them, okay? And then the amoeba are like the blob. They're like, and they're grabbing bacteria and stuff and bringing it in and eating them up, okay? So they're all over the place, but they love to eat bacteria. That's their main job, okay? Now, so as I'm focusing in and out, this is a microarthropod that got squished under the slide. Oops, sorry, it happens sometimes. I don't do it on purpose, okay? I'm not a real meanie. And these ciliates, you'll start to see some of them as I focus in and out kind of moving around. So they're nibbling at a lot of the bacteria that are hanging around the side of this flagellate. And then this here is a teste amoeba. So if I start seeing those in the soil, then I know that there's life there, but these guys have gone into dormancy. So either the pH changed or the temperature, and then the environment wasn't favorable for them. So they've built this shell around them, pulled some organic matter in there, and they'll hang out there until conditions are favorable again to come out and start munching again. So why are these guys really popular? Is because if we just have bacteria in our soil and just fungi, well, then those guys are actually kind of competing with the plant, because bacteria will eat before the plant will eat. So if it's just bacteria eating, then we need to have them to release that. So that's where the predators come in. So this is here a little flagellate cruising around. He's kind of bumbly. As you go in and out, you can kind of just see the tail. Okay, so we want to start seeing these kind of guys in the soil. Oh, my poop loop one went out. Okay. Anyway, so the reason why these guys are being eaten is what's called the poop loop. So if I'm a protozoa and I'm eating a bunch of bacteria, I'm eating so many, like they'll eat up to 5,000 to 10,000 a day. I take what I need for my metabolic process so that I can operate and make new cells and stuff too. And then I'm full. What do? You gotta have poop. So these guys are now pooping stuff out in a form that's soluble. Okay? So those little bacteria become our little fertilizer bags. They're all hanging around the root zone, so it becomes almost like a feeding trough. So imagine you've got a bunch of hungry pigs or cows and you go fill that trough. They hit that trough. Are you going to be able to squeeze in there? It's pretty tight, right? So that's what's happening around there. It becomes this big feeding frenzy. So now the protozoa are eating these bacteria, taking what they need, poop the rest out in a form that's soluble. Now the plant can use those and take that up. Okay? Make sense? So that's a huge thing. We need to have those predators present to make sure that we're getting that nutrient cycling. So another nutrient cyclers are nematodes. So these are like little microscopic worms that cruise around, and they're fairly fast. The one that I've got a picture of, he's really full, so he's kind of lethargic. But they'll nibble on a lot of the protozoa, the nematode, or other nematodes, fungi, and bacteria. So there's a couple different kinds. And you can tell by the morphology of the shape of their face. Now, another neat thing with them too is if you can get that stuff up favorable, so something like a root nematode comes along, and they're like kung fuing them, and they'll actually keep them away. So they're very territorial of their space when it's up to par, right? So it keeps things going. So here, so this is a bacterial feeding nematode. So he's kind of all full in his belly, and he's just kind of full. So we can get these guys going around, and they're doing the same thing. They're nibbling on a lot of these guys, and then they're either pooping out stuff, or sometimes they puke it up. It's all really attractive. And in forms that are now soluble for the plants to use, okay? A little nematode. Okay, so another thing that we need to have at the party is organic matter. So when we look at the plants doing their thing, taking photosynthesis and making sugars down to the critters to feed them, that's one of their big feed sources. But when the plants go into dormancy, or we harvest them because we have what's going on outside, then those organisms need to have some other kind of food source. And that's where organic matter comes into place. So it becomes their condos, their homes, their shelters, the malls. This is where they hang out and get some of their nutrients during the off seasons. And as we build this stuff up, this becomes the sponge. Now, I think a lot of the time the organic matter is usually focused only on the upper profile, but we need to start looking at it more as we dig deeper into the deeper profiles, and then as it becomes carbon, okay? So as we look deeper and deeper into the levels, those are the stuff that becomes more stable and sticks around. So if we're doing a soil test just at the top layers of our profile, then we're getting the new organic matter, but we're not really looking at the old stuff that's now starting to turn into carbon. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and then as we build the organic matter, like historical levels used to be up into the mid-teens where organic matter was up there. So now I talk to a lot of organic farmers in Alberta that are happy with like 1.5%, 2%. That's like scary, because that's 1.5%, 2% away from working with dirt. And once you have dirt, then you're kind of up that creek, you know? Okay? So as we increase that percentage, this is the big thing, because we're going to be, it seems with how we get our weather patterns right now, that we're not getting just light rains and snows, we're getting really big, heavy movements happening. And so we need to have good soil to take advantage of that. So then to hold that water so that it's a slow release during drought times, or then to suck in all that water as a sponge in those heavy rains so that it's not all leaching away and pulling all our topsoil away, right? We want to have that infiltration. So that's a big part of our water cycles are wrecked right now. Have you guys, I don't know if you read much news about what's going on down west as well. There's a place in Saskatchewan called Quill Lakes. Has anybody heard of this? Okay, so Saskatchewan's pretty flat, right? But its lakes are its low spots. So their soil has got such a crazy hard pan in this area that when they're getting heavy rains, it doesn't soak in, it all funnels to the low spots. So this Quill Lake area is this low spot. In the last 16 months, they've had 25,000 acres of usable land go underwater. So now they're like, what do we do with this? Because they can't keep sending it downriver, it's just going to keep causing more problems. So now the watersheds are really starting to work closer with the soil guys, and they're trying to figure out better solutions on how do we get this water to go back down into the soil and replenish the aquifers instead of just flowing away with all our resources, right? So that's just a thing that we need to start to look at. We have to reimagine what this water cycle used to look like and get it back to where it was, okay? So has anybody ever done an infiltration test? Nice. Pat yourself on the back, okay? So this is an easy way to figure out what kind of, what's going on with our soil and if water is going to be penetrating, how the compaction is, and if we've got some aggregation building and whatnot, okay? So what you can do is you can take a coffee can or a PVC pipe or whatnot, you pound it into the soil a little bit, and then you measure out what's going to be about an inch of soil or an inch of water. So you pour that in, you let it soak in, and you time it, and then you pour it in, and then you time it again. So you want to see how fast that takes that inch of water to soak into your soil. So is it going to take a really, really long time, or is it going to happen really quickly? So for example, who's the South Dakota or North Dakota farmer? Gabe Brown. So Gabe Brown, he was just up in Edmonton at the Western Soil Conference back in December, and he was talking about they had, it was an 8-inch rainstorm, and so they were getting what did he test after? 17 to 18 inches in 3 minutes infiltration rate. So his soil's like, it's like a big sponge. His neighbor was just like flooded out all over the place. Lots of standing water. Then he has insect problems and rot and all that kind of stuff. Yeah?
Looks like a reasonable number, the 17 to 18 inches, that's like the golden standard, but like, are there any benchmark numbers to give you a sense of how your soil is doing?
Yeah, if you can be under 10 minutes for like 2 inches, then you're in a good place. And I've seen there's some guys that are getting an inch or two within under a minute. So obviously the faster the better, but under that 10 mark is a good place to start. Okay, so then as we continue with the party, so we've got the microbiology of the bacteria and the fungi, those are the first small guys, and then the predators, the protozoa and the nematodes, and everybody's eating who? So then we get in the next guys, the earthworms. Okay, so these guys are pretty powerful. So they're pulling up mass from below and taking organic matter from above and bringing it below. So they're constantly mixing and tilling the soil on a micro level for us. And a lot of the times, as they're going through and making those tunnels, roots will actually follow those tunnels because there's lots of air there, water flows really well through it, and as they're going through that, they're pooping or they're putting down worm castings, and that's just a high nutrient level. So there's a couple ladies that I've been chatting to on the whole worm side of things. They've been studying for over 25 years, and there's so much that we still don't understand about them. They'll take in 1 unit of calcium and poop out 7. So they're like these little alchemists. They're kind of like little magicians, right? And like they have 5 hearts, and people don't even know why. So they just have lots of love to give, right? Okay? So they're really good at helping mix that soil, and we can use to take them an advantage on that. And if the neatest thing is, if you look at old pictures from like kind of the 60s to 70s, you'll see somebody tearing up their soil and a whole flock of birds hanging behind the field or behind the tractor. And they're all going down and scooping up all the worms as they're brought to the surface, right? You see anybody doing that now? It doesn't happen. The birds have already moved on because they know that there's no food source there anymore, okay? So that's something that can be a good indicator to start to see. Okay, and then we start moving into our other predators, okay? So, the one thing I wanted to say on the worms too is, so a lot of people think that they actually get their nutrition from eating that decomposing material, so like they're taking a leaf litter or something like that. So they're not actually getting their nutrition from that. They're getting their nutrition from the bacteria and the fungi that are surrounding it, the protozoa and the nematodes. So like a chicken, they have a gizzard. So they use that gizzard to grind everything up. So as they pop the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, and nematodes, they're getting their nutrition from the cytoplasm inside them. So they're a good indicator that if you have worms, that at least that there's some microbiology there, because that's what they're getting their nutrition from, okay? Make sense? Awesome possum. Okay, so then we move into our insect side of things, so our microarthropods and our macroarthropods. So these guys are tearing and shredding, and they're dying and pooping and doing all this stuff and adding to that whole story as well, okay? So everybody's got their little bit of a function. Like ground beetles will actually eat slugs. I just found that out a couple years ago, so it's kind of neat. So if we let nature do its thing, everybody kind of keeps everybody in check. But we have to make sure that the environment is favorable for them, okay? And the best reason is you guys sleep at night, right? Okay? These guys don't really do that. They work all the time. So if we work with them, they're working all the time. They don't take days off. They don't take smoke breaks. Like, they're pretty good employees if we want to work with them. So that's the huge bonus of realizing what the microbiology and the organisms can do and then playing along. Okay? So, what do ants do? They're really good at taking organic matter and actually pulling it down into the soil as well. So as they build their burrows, they'll pull a bunch of stuff down there, and then as soon as it gets really airy and the moisture levels start to pick up, then they move away again. Because they'll never really build their ant hills in really moist areas. It's always in dry areas, which is interesting. It was, who was it? I was talking to an entomologist at the Olds College, and you know, looking down at the soil, that's the thing that we don't do as often as we should. And they were doing a study where one of his students went out, and they knew that there was about 40 different species of ants in Alberta. So then he started actually digging down into the soil, and within 18 months, he found another 40 species. So just by looking, he actually found more stuff. So there's a lot going on under there that we kind of take for granted, right? So we want to make sure that the living soil is not dirt, okay? We want to get that, and what's the tagline I like to always say? It's like, soil doesn't like to be treated like dirt, okay? Ha, ha, ha. Okay, so we want to get that sponge. That's essential. That's really essential. As we keep having these crazy water and storm happening and stuff like that, we need to be able to take care of that problem. So as we get that sponge, we're getting better water and air infiltration, and then nutrients are being held into that soil a lot easier too, okay? So compaction is a big issue. When we start getting that compacted soil, the roots can't grow down very deep. Like, how deep can alfalfa roots go? Anybody? 10, 12, yeah. Okay, so they've found in some places in Saskatchewan, Alberta, they were down 15, 17 feet. Okay, so roots on some plants will go super deep if we give them the soil to do that in. They'll figure out ways to get down there, but as soon as we get these compacted layers, what happens is things go anaerobic. So aerobic is lots of oxygen or oxygen-loving, so that's what most of the organisms like ourselves, but then anaerobic is like oxygen-hating or no or very little oxygen. So what happens is then we start getting alcohols building up. And a root, it'll figure out how to get down there, but if it hits alcohol, it'll turn right around. And the alcohol will just fry them, okay? So this was a little thing that we did with some corn, was these are 3-week seedlings. This one was tapped about 500 times. I didn't do that. That was somebody else. Okay? And you can see the roots end about there. This one was tapped about 250 times. They went here. This one was just tapped lightly so that it was even with the others, and it grew down a full foot. Okay, so it's putting a lot of its energy down to get there, find those nutrients so that then, boom, it can work on the foliage side of things. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're testing the compaction. This is a farmer just east of Strathmore out in Alberta. He grows red fife wheat, so it's like 6 feet tall. So this was a week-old seedling, so you can see how much energy it put into its roots first. Okay, and he's got great tillers there, so he's getting some good production out of that. So this is where we need to start looking at, like, okay, if we're doing a lot of annual programs, maybe we should look into bringing a perennial system in every once in a while, or working with some of these more perennial cover crops just because of the amount of biomass that they produce above ground, but also below ground. So that's taking that carbon and pulling it down there. And every time we work with a different plant, that diversity works with a different diversity of microorganisms as well. So then we're increasing that diversity. So the higher diversity of organisms we have in our soil, the higher chance we have of an organism working with the plant and the conditions that we need. Okay, does that make sense? It's like playing the numbers. You want to have the larger numbers to cover that base. So, has anybody ever seen this? This is called succession. Okay, so this comes from my buddy Doug Weatherby. So, I don't know if what did I do? Didn't do nothing. Okay, so, I thought it had a pointer. Oh, it does. Woohoo! Okay, so on the far spectrum, so if we let land just sit and do its thing, it's going to go from one succession to another. So depending on environmental conditions, that could take 500 years, 1,000 years, whatnot. So on the far spectrum, we have our weeds, okay? So those guys are showing up, they're doing their thing first, and then as they've done their job, they start to die out, and then the early grasses come in, okay? They start doing their thing. They're increasing a little bit more biomass and diversity. We get into our more prairie grasses, so they're little deeper root zones and taller biomass, and then we can move into, in the middle, kind of our vegetable crops, our agricultural crops, and even our turf grasses. And then we start to move more into that perennial side of things. So we get into the shrubs, the brambles, the bushes, then into the deciduous trees, and then the far spectrum, the conifer trees. Okay? So it always wants to go that direction, but sometimes it goes the other direction. So what would cause that? Tillage, yeah. Forest fire. Okay, floods, landslides, okay. So there's a lot of natural occurrences that can take it the other way, but for the most part, it's us, right? So I'm not saying that tilling is a bad thing, it's just another tool, but it's just how it's used, right? We have to realize that we're doing certain things. So even looking at around some of the larger municipalities and stuff where, you know, you've got Farmer Joe who is trying to convince his kids to take over the ranch, so he's got a beautiful native prairie, so he can't get any of the kids to take over, so he sells it to the city. The city comes in to put in a new development in there, and they tear everything up, and they're driving all the big tractors around, and they're doing all this, and they put in the infrastructure for the plumbing and the electrical and all that, and then you figure out where the house is going to go, and they pour in the foundation with big cement trucks, and they're still doing all this compaction, and then, knocking stuff off here. And then they build the house, and then they bring in a ½ inch of topsoil, put some sod on it, and then they say, see you later. Okay, so what's going to show up first of all? Weeds, dandelions, right? So they're telling us, they're going, hey, this soil is not soil, there's something wrong here, you need to fix something. So that's their main job, is to, especially the taproot ones, they're trying to break up the compaction. They want to just have babies and die, and as they're building up that biomass, it's loosening up the soil and building some biomass above and below ground. And they're pulling up nutrients up from the subsoils to get them up to the top so that we can have the next succession of plants. So they're telling us a story. So looking at that, we want to look at what's going below ground then too, okay? So the fungi is the one that usually gets beat up. So especially down west, most of our soils are bacteria dominated, so we're not there growing canola and wheat and stuff. We're actually more there to grow weeds. So that's why farmers are pulling their hair out, and there's a lot of bald pates out there, okay? So if we can realize that and start working again, then we can build that fungal back up, and we're going to have better results and decrease that weed suppression, right? So another thing too is when we go and then we till that field, we're producing a lot of oxygen in there, we're flipping it up, the bacteria are like, whoa, oxygen, food, and they start reproducing huge, and then it changes that ratio again. So then boom, what happens next? Weeds start to show up, then he's got to go out with the herbicide, boom, he's wrecking that even further, maybe even a fungicide, it kills more fungal, and it's just this ongoing cycle, right? You can't tell me that some of these bigger companies don't know this, okay? So we want to be focused on that. And then looking at some of our tree side of things, if we're putting in windbreaks or whatnot, they need more of a fungally dominated soil. So if you see a tree in a city that's grown around by grass, that grass is now competing with that tree. Because grass doesn't really grow like that in a forest. They like to have residue and carbon sources that are breaking down, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what's feeding the fungal so that then it can constantly keep feeding that tree, right? So that's just a neat way to look at that to give you an idea of what's going on. So most of the times we're missing that fungal component in our soils. So if we can get that more balance, kind of that ratio of 1-to-1, then we're going to have a lot better results, okay? So a couple other ways I just want you to, does anybody ever dug a hole in their field? Okay, right on. It's better than Alberta and Saskatchewan. Okay, so a lot of people don't dig holes, or if you're going to go buy some more land, dig a hole there before you go buy it. See what you're going to be working with, what you're going to be spending your money on. So we can start visually looking at stuff, what's going on in that soil. That's going to be one of the easiest ways for us to start to see those changes and know what we're working with. Okay, so it's bioagronomics.com. They have this kit that you can print out that goes through all these visual assessments and then even more. And I encourage you, like, you should make it as a monthly event where, hey, come to my farm, I'm digging a hole, let's hang out and drink some coffees or some pints or whatever and chat about the soil and look at it and play around with it. Get familiar with it, because it's your number one resource. So if you're not focusing your time and effort on that, then your end product, your cash crops, are going to suffer, right? Okay? How are we doing for time? Because I didn't even... Okay, cool. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I went faster than I want, but it's okay. So another one is using a penetrometer. Has anybody ever used one of these? Okay, awesome. Okay, so another tool to go test your compaction. So you can go out there and you press it into the ground, and it gives you a basis of a PSI reading. So if it gets way above, like into the 200s, 250s, well, roots are not going to be doing that. Like, they're pretty resilient, but there's a limit that they have, right? So it gives you a good idea. Another simple way is just taking a piece of rebar and bending it off to the side and then just go. And if you give yourself an aneurysm or you pull a muscle by trying to push it in, then obviously you have some compaction issues. But then if you can come and press it in really simple, that's giving you a basis that, okay, well, we've got some good aggregation down there. Those roots are going to be able to get a lot deeper and get the nutrients in the air and the water that they need. So super powerful tool. I think it's like $300, so not a lot of money to spend to work with something like that, okay? And another fun one, I don't know if anybody's ever done, I think it started in Ontario. Did this start in Ontario? I think it's a lot of the guys down south, but just a simple way to figure out if you've got microbiology activity. So by burying the undies, I recommend buying a new one because you don't want to embarrass yourself if you got some racy ones that you're pulling out of your drawer. Putting it in the soil, have a dare with your neighbor or something and get them to do the same thing, and then pull it out at the end of the season and see if all that cotton material was decomposed and broken down. So by seeing that, then that shows you that there's at least some activity going in there that eats that stuff up. So it's just a fun little way to kind of do that, because I think we're almost too serious and stuff with ourselves. So this is just a neat way to kind of take that down a notch. And we've been doing it with a lot of kids in schools in their gardens and whatnot, and they just get a ride out of it, because they do it before they leave at the end of the year, and then that's the first thing they're excited about when they get back to school. Let's go dig out the undies, okay? So it's just a neat way to do it. And if you can think of other kind of little simple ways to do it, then bring it out and chat about it, right? Okay? And then I want to talk about the whole weeds thing. I think this whole thing is, yes, there's definitely noxious weeds that we have some problems with, but for the most part, a lot of the weeds, they all have indicators of stuff that they're bringing up. You can Google what's called a bioaccumulator list, and it gives you a list of all these different plants and then the nutrients that they pull up from the subsoil. So you can use them as kind of a cover crop basis, or gives you an idea if that's growing in your soil, that what your soil is a little depleted in, okay? So I think they give them their name, they're given bad name too much. So we just need to use them more as an indicator and let them tell their story, okay? Because especially in the city side of things, like, you can go into a natural food store and buy a dandelion root tea for like $50, And here people are spraying $50 on it to try to kill it. But then it didn't do its job, so it just comes back again next year. So like for guys that are doing that as a business, that's a pretty good business plan because they know they're gonna have work year after year because they're not letting the plant do its thing. So instead of, there's actually, it was a sod farmer in Vernon, BC, and he was having such issues with dandelions that he was like, oh man, I'm ready to start growing dandelions. So now he just grows dandelions. And he harvests the milk out of it, and it's used as a replacement for latex. Yeah. So, and then he sells the flowers and the roots as well. So he's got a kind of a triple income stream going there. So it's pretty neat. So they're not always the bad guys. And there's some neat things if you look, as Nicole Masters has been doing a lot of this, and we played around with it this summer, is if you've got your cash crop growing, and then you've got lots of weeds growing of the same kind in that same field of the cash crop, if you do a tissue sample of the cash crop and then do a tissue sample of that weed and then line them up next to next, what you're short of for nutrients in the cash crop, I guarantee you'll be higher in that weed. So the weed is trying to help the cash crop. So we need to kind of work with that a little bit, all right? And then another thing that Nicole Masters is playing around with, if you're not familiar with her, her site is called Integrity Soils. Really awesome lady, super cheeky, so it's neat to see a woman really giving it to the guys out there. She's been doing stuff, we're taking some of these weeds and putting them in and fermenting them and then making a liquid out of them. So it's pulling the biology and the nutrients out of it and then spraying that on the other existing weeds, and they're actually like going away. So that's still kind of new, what she's doing right now, and I think we're gonna do some more trials the next couple years, but that just gives you maybe another basis to experiment and play around with that stuff. Like if you're not sure that you wanna try something, just do a 1-by-1 plot and experiment, because I think you guys are lucky here. I find your agricultural ministers are kind of way ahead of the game. The guys in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they'll come and they do these talks and everybody's like, why are you here? You're not even doing anything with the soil. Like it's not even applicable. So I think if you guys are the experts, so if you give yourself the push and the yichies to actually do it, you're gonna be the one to figure out a lot of these things with some of the existing help. But you need to do that push yourself. So do these little experiments and try it, right? You don't have to do a whole field all the time, just do a little bit and play around to see what works. Because our conditions and our environments are all different, it's really hard to say, this is what you go do, because it's a different story for each farmer and each situation, right? Okay? So in the end, I think I like doing analogies, but you know, we can go to a doctor and just get them to give us something, but it's, again, we're dealing with how do you word it? Not the cause, the symptom, not the cause, right? So maybe we need to start looking at that kind of stuff too, because soil, it is our #1 resource that we're working with all this stuff. It's actually the one thing that's responsible for us to be surviving as a species. And if we're just throwing like haphazard things at it to kind of fix it or little Band-Aid solutions, we need to start looking at this more long-term. And the biology is a big part of that because they've been around here way longer than we have. So understanding at least a little bit how it is, then it gives you a couple more tools to put on your tool belt to use when applicable, okay? Make sense? All right. Well, thank you very much, and I guess we got some time for some questions. I'm sure there'll be some questions, maybe? No? Questions?
You mentioned some researchers that were looking into worms, and I just wanted their name.
Yes, Odette Menard is the big one. She's in Quebec. And then there's, shoot, what's his name? I'll get back to you on the other guy. He's in Alberta.
I have some wonderful sandy loams that's got like 33% base saturation. Oh, I guess I have to stand up too. I have some wonderful sandy loam that's got like 33% base saturation in magnesium. So pretty tight stuff. How do I tell with a penetrometer whether it's compaction or whether it's just the magnesium that's blocking the soil?
Right. So that's a great question. Everybody caught that? Okay, so he's got high levels of magnesium, so that's what's tightening his soils up. And how do you tell with the pentrometer if that's what's causing it, just the compaction, or if it's the actual nutrient itself? So that's where, when we start measuring stuff, so we're using a soil test, we're using some of these tools, that's going to get us, we become almost detectives, right? So we're trying to go, okay, so is it this or not? So that, with something like that, I go, okay, can I build this one, do a little sample of trying to build up the organic matter to see if that's going to help break up the compaction and get some more air up there and whatnot? Or maybe taking a little bit of elemental sulfur and taking some of that magnesium and making those Epsom salts so that you can wash a bit of it out, and playing around with that and see which one works better in your situation. So yeah, that's going to be tough to figure out by just one or the other, but that's again where we have to just experiment and play. Does that make sense? Yep. Yeah, okay. So like one thing I should have mentioned too is if you're interested on the whole microbiology side, there's a really good book called Teeming with Microbes. And it's a really, really simple, easy read. It was like my Bible when I first kind of started this. Lots of good pictures and really good explanations on breaking it down and not making it too technical and bobbing for apples because it's so boring, but it's actually kind of entertaining. And then another good little resource is thesoildoctor.org. That's Doug Weatherby's site. He's not in practice anymore, but he's got a wicked video on there that's about 45 minutes that really explains a lot of this stuff as well. Okay.
Question here.
How does farm drainage affect the living soil?
Tile
drainage?
The tile drainage, yeah. So the tile drainage, I've been chatting with a couple permaculture guys about this one just because it's really popular here, like way popular here than it is anywhere else. And when I was up in Thunder Bay last year, after I spoke, there was a guy that was for one of the insurance companies talking about insurance for flood and drought mitigation. So if we've got high levels of water, maybe instead of just totally moving it off the land, maybe it's better off to find a low spot and pool some of it so that we can use that maybe for some of those drought periods, or even as a fire hazard kind of thing, because that's going to become more and more prevalent down the road as well. So that one's going to be a bit of a tough one because everybody's a little different, but I wouldn't want to try to get rid of all of it. I want to keep some of it around just for those time periods that we do become super dry, right? I think it probably does affect the biology for sure, because if there's going to be a certain amount of life that's learned how to live in those conditions, and then if we change that drastically, then we have to kind of start fresh again. So there are another diversity of organisms that we can have in there that work at those times of high moisture. Yeah.
Hi, I'm just a novice, and this is not referring to commercial farming. This is just a family plot of vegetable gardening.
Okay.
Very large plot, very clay, very hard soil. It's produced some really good produce, but my question is, there's some debate going on whether it's better to rototill it up periodically through the season, or just to mulch and leave it alone in terms of weeding, and also of how to break up that clay.
Right, okay. So this is always a debatable one, but in my opinion, this is what I would do. So if I started with a new plot and it was really high gumbo clay, I would bring in a ton of organic matter, like some compost or something, till it all in, mix it all up, and then never do that again. So then if you're still getting some of that tightness and that stickiness, there's always been that story of, oh, before I grow anything, I always grow potatoes because they break up the land. And that's kind of what they do. So guys in larger situations are starting to use the tillage radish quite a bit and having really good success at that. And so it grows really big tubers, breaks that stuff up, but then they leave it in there to rot. So now you leave the organisms some food that they can come and take that and start mixing it on a micro level. There's a couple companies that did some trials in Alberta where they mixed in the compost, they turned it in, or they just left it on top. And they always had better returns and results with just leaving it on top. Because then the organisms, that's their job. So that's kind of similar to what happens in a native meadow or in a forest too. Nobody's going in there and tilling that stuff. It's all up to the animals and the organisms that interact with it. Does that answer your question? Yeah, awesome.
Question here. Could you stand?
Sure. Just back to the party, just for a moment.
Yeah.
We always talked about algae, bacteria, and fungi. So what role do what different types of algae are invited to the party?
Yeah. So bacteria can be algae can slide into that kind of category as the algae. So algae is kind of still like a plant material, right? So they're the ones that are going to actually be producing some oxygen and stuff as well. So in areas where they are prevalent, they're actually going to help keep those conditions in aerobic form. And then they're typically going to be showing up more in just if we're having standing water, if we've got kind of some swampy areas or some ponds and stuff. I know there's a lot of farmers that are actually using it as their nitrogen source. So guys are now farming algae and using it as a nitrogen source. So that's as they die off, they're providing that form to the plants as well. Or then bacteria and stuff will, as they die out, they take that nitrogen and then hold it in them so it doesn't leach out. So yeah, they're pretty powerful to have in the soil as well. But for most places like having lots of sand, they're probably not going to show up as prevalent. It's going to be where you're kind of in more of those moist areas, right? Because yeah, they're a high moisture loving little critter. Yeah.
Question here. Question, comment, I guess. Your example about Quill Lake and
Yeah.
the issues that they have there, and the high organic matter, how it helps with infiltration. The loss of wetlands and the lack of organic matter being lost, the sponge that they provide on the
huge.
landscape could be a component of that as well. And we have that issue in our southern Ontario where we're losing wetlands and losing that storage capacity on the land by losing those sponges from the land too.
Yeah.
And tile drainage lands into that too, and some of the
Huge.
farming marginal areas of losing that. So
Yeah.
maintaining and protecting our wetlands would be key to
Yeah.
just reducing that runoff.
Yeah, and the wetlands are a huge part of that water cycle, right? And we were having this conversation coming in today, or maybe it was last night, but I, myself, and others can preach this stuff till we're blue in the face, and it may alter people to look at things a little differently or change their patterns or how they manage their farms. But in the end, I really think it's going to come down to we're going to be forced to do certain changes because of the water. And there's some huge programs that are starting out west already that are actually paying farmers pretty good money and big incentives to reestablish the wetlands and even put stuff in, because it does make a huge difference. It's what cleans the water. It keeps all that sediments and stuff in place, right? So respect the beaver.
Question here.
In your opinion,
Get your head out of the gutter.
is there a relationship between on-farm biodiversity, native trees, shrubs, wildflowers, grasses to healthy soil? And if so, can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, oh, definitely. So if we look at anywhere in nature, we don't see just one species just hanging out. It doesn't exist, right? So when we start having all these high levels of diversity of plants and grasses and forbs and flowers and trees, we're bringing in huge amounts of different organisms and insects and stuff that are all helping with the pollination of things, but then also organisms that are eating and taking out other bad pests and stuff, right? That's where I start to see, looking at regular conventional agriculture, or just even some of the organic side of things, the introduction of intercropping, the cover crops, like some of the stuff that Gabe Brown and some of those big wigs, and even some of the guys in Alberta and Saskatchewan now, they're playing around with cover crops of like 10 to 12 different species. So a huge diversity. So every time you have a different plant growing, there's a handful of microorganisms that are going to be working with that, and a handful of insects and stuff that are going to be working with it above. And now you're attracting birds and everything, especially if you start giving the trees and everything a chance to grow. Like windbreaks, you need to have windbreaks. But now they're being labeled as eco-buffers. So instead of just having one stand of trees, make it like a little mini forest alley. So you have multiple levels of trees, so that if ones are falling down or dying, then you have a succession of other stuff coming in. But then birds and everything can hang out there. Your mycorrhizal has a place to hang out and creep back in. Okay, so it's giving you a chance, it's making it more natural and making where that whole ecology and how everything links up, this huge web, and making it that much more healthier. So the higher diversity of things that you can have, the healthier chance you're going to have of getting anything done. So that's a great thing to bring up. Thanks, Gary.
Most organic fertilizer companies offer a fish product. who's getting invited to the party with that, and what's the best way of handling that product?
Yeah. So there's two ones that usually show up in that. So there's a fish hydrosylate and there's a fish emulsion. So one is where they're just actually taking the whole fish and they just ground it up. So that one, you're getting the oils from that, and that will actually feed your fungal biology. So they like that oils, it's more complex. But if that's getting skimmed out, and so you'll be able to read on it, they'll add some kind of preservative into it to keep it from going off, then that's just gonna be more of a nitrogen source. So you'll get some nitrogen, some other, some elements and stuff from it too, but then that'll be feeding the bacteria. So you wanna make sure it has the oil. The oil is what we're looking for to feed the fungal. That's the fish hydrosylate.
Question here?
Yeah.
Last question?
Last question.
Okay. Just in kind of a continuation of that question, I was wondering if you could comment on the spectrum as well as efficacy of inoculants.
Of inoculants, okay. So as this whole biology side thing is becoming more and more popular, you're definitely seeing a lot more of products coming online. And there's a lot of stuff that is just being thrown out there. So a guy can be like for example, there's a product called trichoderma. So it's a fungus that you can buy and you can use it as a seed treatment. I totally reverse that. And then what that does is help compete against rusts and stuff like that. But it'll also attack like larvae and different eggs of different critters that might be munching down on your cash crops as well. So when you start getting more of these products coming out, there are ones that you have to be asking for like levels of validation. Even with some of the mycorrhizal inoculants, there's a lot of guys that are just selling like a basically a clay base and there's nothing really in it. So you want to start seeing validations of stuff with testing from labs to make sure that those stuff are in there. But then also you want to make sure that there was some kind of studies done and stuff too. So make sure that they used it and actually had results with something like that. Because there's a lot of guys that are pretty slick at telling you what they want, but maybe it's more for an interest of what's going in their pocket instead of what's going out on your field, right? So that's the thing again too. If you want, just do little one-by-one plots. Go, okay, well, I don't want to buy anything off you, but give me a sample and I'll try a little plot out and experiment with it. Because we all have different situations again, it could be something that just might not work for you, okay? Or it might work really awesome. Okay, great question. Did I answer it? Okay, all right, sweet. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mike. Please join me in
Beam me up, Scotty.
thanking Mike.